I'm Dan Severson. Friends call me Doc. I'm from Sauk Rapids, Minnesota. I'm a former legislator for District 14A, Minnesota.
Uh, why are you here today, Dan?
Bill, I was in the legislature for 8 years, 4 terms in the Minnesota House. And probably about my second term, I had some people come to me in increasing numbers about some of the abuses they had been experiencing in the judicial system. And at first, I kind of discounted it as some people who had just, fallen on some bad times and been in the grinder. But the more I began to research and the more I began to look at the statutes and what was going on in our judicial branch, I began to see that there were some real problems that we have in our third branch of government, the judiciary. And so that whole process brought me to sponsor a bill, which I did with a number of citizens, 1632, which talked about judicial standards reform, in which there was a judicial oversight board that would actually be reconstructed. And a little history on this, it was in the early 70s that the legislature gave up their authority for oversight over the judiciary. In the Constitution, it's quite clear in Article 7 that the legislature has a responsibility for oversight. In the early 70s, they put together that Board of Judicial Standards and basically abdicated their power over to this board, which is largely put together by gubernatorial appointees and by the judges and by the lawyer association. There's a number of problems with that. Number one is that the judges hold the licensure for all the lawyers in the state. So if you're going to practice law in a courtroom, you have to practice beholden to those who are making the determination. And there was just a lot of things that I began to see in this process. And when I initially put the bill in about 2 weeks, I had 2 Supreme Court justices in my office telling me why this was a bad idea. And so that kind of keyed me to that we've hit a nerve here, and there's probably got more to do with this than one would normally think. And so as we began to educate on this, I could not get a hearing, even though my party was in control at that time. And so I held an ad hoc hearing, and I invited other legislators and the people to be able to give testimony, so at least they would have the opportunity to be in front of a makeshift panel that the legislature put together and have their voice heard. And we had some very compelling testimony put out that day. And I think for the people that attended and those that were able to give testimony, it was kind of a landmark for them to say, hey, we can make this happen. And so to me, it was kind of a fulfilling of my obligation to the people was that you will have your voice heard in government. And in that process, we began to pick up a case that was what I kind of viewed as a model case. We had an E5 sergeant in the Air Force who had been going through a messy divorce hearing, and the judge basically said, you're a baby killer, you're a wanton warmonger, and I'm going to do everything I can to destroy you. And she did. And so we brought that in front of the public system and held a couple news conferences. But again, it's such a new arena that people have not looked to in the past in terms of things being wrong, that it's got to gather some knowledge, some momentum, some ability for people to say, hey, but for the grace of God, there go I, because you get caught up in that system and pretty soon you have no recourse and nobody's looking out for you. And so I guess I'm rambling on here a little bit, but I think the issue for me as a legislature was to ensure that the balance of powers that our founding fathers had put together were realized, that they were enacted, that they were protected. And right now I believe very strongly that the judiciary has moved far beyond their confines of our Constitution, are legislating from the bench, and we have people who are given to power. One of the other problems we've got in the legislature as well is that we have a lot of lawyers who get into the legislature for the sole purpose of being visible enough to get elected to the bench or to get appointed to the bench. And then they've been working hard with the Quay Commission report and the rest to try and suitcase their ability to stay on the bench once they get there, so that they've done things like the the statute that basically says they can't have their past rulings recorded. That was struck down in the Supreme Court by, I think it was Wurzel versus Republican Party, or it was the Republican Party versus White, I think it was. But the bottom line was that was struck down, so now they're absolutely vulnerable in terms of how they've been ruling, and that's what precipitated the Quay Commission report and the press to go to a retention election, which would take the power and the ability of the people to make the decision instead of the governor or appointed positions. So I think there are a number of things that need to be done. I appreciate what you're doing here, Bill, with bringing this to the forefront and bringing it to the people, the Congress, and to the legislature, and saying, you know what, this is a very real problem. We have a branch of government, and as a legislator, I think it was in my third term where we couldn't get a budget put together, and we went into government shutdown, and the Supreme Court came back and ruled that they could loose some of the funds that they felt were expedient to pay off some of the public workers and some of the things that were shut down because of the government shutdown, which was totally beyond the Constitution. They have interpreted on numerous occasions the Constitution far beyond what the original intent ever was, and then they justify that by saying we wear black robes and we make the decisions. Doesn't work.
Yeah, they're pretty bold. You know, the judges say, I make the rule, I make the law in this room. It's unbelievable.
Yep.
When was this ad hoc hearing that you had?
You know, I'm trying to remember what, I think it was in the end of my second, it was the end of my second term, which would probably have been in 2005, 2006 time frame.
One of the things we're doing is presenting 48 pieces of either proposed legislation or amendments. It's just 48 bullet points, really, to all the members of the state legislature in each state. And so I'll make sure and email you a copy so that you can pass it on to people that you know. They're very logical, common sense proposals. That's why I'm sure none of them will get passed.
There's hope. We got a new batch of legislators that are coming up this time around, and I think we've got some very good ones. We've got, you know, my hopes are that we can change out the look.
I'm a Minnesotan. I lived here as a 5-year-old for 6 months, so once a Minnesotan, always a Minnesotan. I have always been especially partial to people from Minnesota. I don't know what it is. I've just had good relationships, and so I do believe that there are good people in the legislature. We had Dale Nathan here earlier. Do you know Dale?
I know Dale well. Yep.
And you know, he was saying that he gave us names of a number of good ones, and he even had names of a couple of judges he thinks are honest. I have a standing invitation. Any honest judge is welcome to come and sit down with me anywhere in the country, anytime. We're still waiting, but we do have one coming up in San Diego, that former federal judge. But I would hope that you could pass this along. I mean, for example, the first proposal is the easiest. All court proceedings must be recorded.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Simple deal.
Yep.
And each party should have the right to do their own recording. The reason for that is because we've got plenty of documentation of falsified transcripts and falsified audio tapes. These folks will do just about anything. And so, but this would be a simple thing. And there's no one that can come up with a reason not to pass something like that. They'll try to say that, oh, you got to protect juveniles. Well, wait, juveniles are protected. This isn't going to CNN.
Right.
This is a court record, and the parties should always have a right to anything that's part of a court record.
Yep.
So it's, you know, put a restriction on that they can't make it available to anybody else. That's an easy one. Some of them get a little bit harder. The key to our proposals, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, is creation of what we call special regulatory grand juries. 23 people probably would have to serve for like at least 6 months, maybe a year at a time. And their sole mission is to keep government honest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, grand juries have two powers, indictment and presentment. Everybody knows about indictment. very few people know about presentment, but presentment was designed so that people could keep the government accountable.
Mm-hmm.
They bring charges independently of any prosecutor and present it to a judge and say, this needs to be pursued. So our proposal is that we create these special regulatory grand juries that each state does, and then when the citizens have an issue that they think is unfair, they take it to them.
Yep.
And they have the power to investigate and then hear the ones that they feel are valid. And in New Hampshire, they're doing something like that this year. The Speaker of the House there, Republican, put together something called a grievance committee, and it's totally staffed by members of the state house. And they're doing exactly this. And on the cases that they've chosen to consider, it's almost 100%.
Yeah.
They ruled in favor of the people who brought the
Yep.
complaint. And mainly, it seems, family court issues. So what do you think about that as a solution, the creation of special grand juries to deal with this?
No, I think it's a great idea. I think, the whole concept from our founders was a review by a panel of your peers. Basically, the grand jury was that provision. When I was running this particular case that I was telling you about with the sergeant who had he had a TS, top secret background investigation, and because of some of the charges that were filed against him, he ended up losing that, and just drove him into bankruptcy. Well, we knew that the judge was corrupt in this process, and we had requested a review of this by a grand jury in this particular area where he lived. So we by subversive means, ended up finding who the foreman of the sequestered grand jury was, and we delivered, registered mail, to that person's door a copy of the transcripts and the grievances. And so about 2 days later, I followed up with a phone call. She said, well, I talked to the county attorney, and he said, well, I'll take that. So he gave it to him. Well, the judge that was hearing this case was one of the suspects in this whole process of the corruption. So it never went anywhere. It just got blinded. So that's the problem we have with the grand jury, is they're sequestered. They're 6 months usually. They're assigned to it. They really have no idea what their responsibilities are. And in order to get to them, you can't go through any kind of normal means. So they're really inaccessible to the public. They become a tool of the county attorney, and the county attorney keeps them in the dark just to fill in the block that says, oh, we have a grand jury sequestered and we're meeting our requirements. But they are a totally ineffectual branch.
Yeah, I worked for 2 years to get in front of the Fulton County, Georgia grand jury to bring criminal charges against 6 federal judges, the Fulton County district attorney, and a couple of private attorneys. And I finally got a letter in the hands of, through some means. I sat in their lobby the days they met, which was sealed off inside the district attorney's office is the grand jury room.
Right.
In the Georgia Constitution, the district attorney has no authority over the grand jury whatsoever, but of course they treat them as if they're their own little tool.
Exactly. Yep.
Anyway, I finally got before them. I testified, presented my charges. They invited me back. That was on a Friday. They invited me back on the following Tuesday, their next session. And surprise, surprise, when I got off the elevator on the 3rd floor, public elevator lobby of the public courthouse, I was met by 3 Fulton County Sheriff's deputies and the chief investigator for the district attorney, who forcibly removed me from the courthouse and gave me a criminal trespass warning, saying that if I ever returned, I would be arrested. I filed criminal charges, which were dismissed before the hearing ever began on the day of the trial that was set up, with a little clerk bringing a little order out. Filed a civil action. The judge dismissed it and ordered that I could never file another lawsuit anywhere in America for the rest of my life.
Oh my goodness.
And it gets worse from there.
Yeah.
10 years minimum prison term for interfering with somebody in the middle of their grand jury testimony. But nobody will do anything about it. All the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, who I asked to tell the federal judges in Georgia they had to abide by the Constitution. And they responded that they refused to do that. And that's what led to this movie. That was a couple of years ago, and a bunch of people heard about that on the internet and were kind of outraged. And I got over 10,000 emails in the first week. Last count, it was up to 10,000 different people emailing. I've got a program that keeps track of it, so last count of over 45,000. They all want to tell me their story.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So I'm sure you've heard plenty.
Yep. No, it's an indicator of an abusive system.
You know, the people watching this movie don't have a clue.
Right.
What would you say to them? How can you get through to them? You know, you're a respected person in the community, a legislator for many years. I think they might listen to you.
Well, I guess the biggest thing I would say is people don't pay attention unless it actually affects them. The problem with this problem is that you don't know when it's going to affect you or how it's going to affect you. And once you get scooped up in the system and it begins to work against you, you have no recourse. You completely lose your God-given and natural rights as a U.S. citizen, as an American citizen, and are subject to the confines of the guy that's sitting on the bench. And so I think it is probably better to be proactive than reactive in this particular situation. We can take back our judiciary. We can take back that branch of government, but we have to hold the bench accountable. And we do that through the election process. We need to take away all of the protections that the judicial branch has put up to keep them incumbent and keep those powers on the bench. We need to diversify those powers. The attorneys' licensure should never be held by the courts. They should be held independently. And the courts should be able to be as close to the people as possible. That's what our founders really intended, and that is the strict adherence to the Constitution. And none of the legalese, none of the interpretations that have been going on that have been expanding the rights of the judiciary, that have been expanding the rights of the executive branch, were ever intended by our founders. We need to get back to the basics, and I believe that starts with the judiciary reform.
You know, I call the folks who are aligned with me in this the nobodies.
Yeah, that's good.
99% nobodies.
Yep.
There's 1% that kind of controls things, maybe less. And, you know, so our mission here is can a group of nobodies save America? I believe it's that serious.
Yep.
I mean, people they just don't have a clue. We don't have constitutional rights anymore. A judge just does whatever they want. Law enforcement does whatever they want.
Yep. Well, and I think a good example of that, Bill, is, you know, when our founders really put together the whole concept of a peaceable community, and our law enforcers were called peace officers, and now they're police. And what do you relate police to? Police is a police state, something that orchestrates the behavior of the people because they have to adhere to a certain conduct, and that was never the intent. The intent was to keep peace in the community, to be kind of like the Mayberry, where you don't carry around a gun, you just try and, through relationship, try and make sure everybody is living within their own rights and are not becoming onerous to the community. And it's unfortunate that, because with power comes, you know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so we've kind of come to a police state as well in many of the larger areas where the police have taken, probably for self-preservation means, more authority than they should be, but it creates fear in the community because sometimes those people who are hungry for power abuse that power, and it gives the police a bad name. I'd prefer to see them go back to peacekeepers, you know, to peace officers.
Preserve and protect.
Yep.
Doesn't seem to be exactly what they're doing. And sometimes I'm sure this is a tough job, but the things that I've heard about what various police officers, and more in the area of officer-induced domestic violence, you know, a policeman gets away with just about whatever he can do to a spouse or an ex-spouse.
Well, and I attribute a lot of that to the failed judicial system as well, because you know, in the family law provisions that we have now, there is so much room for abuse, and that it's dysfunctional because it is not working to keep the family together. It's just working to be an arbiter, and that's not really their goal. That should not be they should not be put into that situation. So we've got a lot of good peace officers, you know, police, who get stuck into bad situations too. But again, I bring that back to the whole judicial side, And the failure of that, and for me, I believe that in Minnesota that is in the form of no-fault divorce. I think that has been one of the most damaging pieces of legislation towards our family coherence or ability to maintain the family. It's just a bad legislation that needs to be repealed.
We have one lady who's an expert on the funding, and her position is this is all about money.
Mm-hmm.
And she says in the federal, imagine that, in the federal budget, there's something like $15 billion to pay to states for foster care and adopting. And for adopting out, they get paid bonuses. And if it's a special needs or handicapped child, they get paid an extra $4,000. She says there's $15 billion for that. There's only $400 million for trying to keep families together.
Yeah, yeah.
That very graphically tells you, it seems like there's even bigger disparity than that.
Yep.
The family court stories that I've heard are horrible, and I'll tell you what, I've heard some of the worst ones here in Minnesota.
Yep.
Just in Carver County alone, there are stories of there's no way in the world that could have happened to that person, but it did.
Yeah, see, and that's what I'm talking about. When you get into the meat grinder, you have no intention of getting in there, but all of a sudden, and I'll tell you, when I was door knocking as a legislator, and I'd go around, and I met with so many, particularly young men who had been through this because of the no-fault divorce. They'd been their marriages had been dissolved, and now they were being taken to the cleaners. I mean, they were behind in child support, so they'd lose their driver's license, so now they couldn't get to their job, and it's just a tremendous downward spiral. And I'll tell you honestly, both parties are bad in this process in terms of family law. Republicans have been as bad as the Democrats. And we need some real reform in how we begin to restructure and bring the family protection back into our statutes.
Well, it ruins the kids almost
Yep.
all the time.
Yep.
When you get into these contentious situations. And somebody had a recommendation, they said, that I thought was great. If there's no allegation of abuse or anything crazy by either party, then it should be joint custody.
Yep.
And then I had another recommendation I thought was great, and that was one of the parents gets the children for the school year, the other one gets them for vacations and holidays and summer. And they can flip-flop back and forth if they want, but that way you don't disrupt a child's time in school. You know, this idea of them packing up and going over to another house, I guess I would be for 50-50, but that seemed like a pretty good proposal. That might give somebody a little less time, but they could flip-flop back and forth in terms of one year somebody has them in the school year, the next one has them, as long as it's the same school.
Yeah.
But there just has to be somebody caring about the children. And from my experience, and this is you're probably about the 550th person that I've interviewed in this great odyssey, it's almost always the spouse that has the money, which isn't always the man, but is often. And yet, if a woman or a man claims there's abuse, then they almost always lose. I don't understand how that works.
Yeah.
If you're a man and you call and you say there's abuse and your wife is abusing, then it goes to the woman. And if it's the other way around, it goes to the man. It's incredible.
Yeah.
We've had more women show up and talk than we have had men.
Oh, really?
And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe just the luck of the draw, but we've gotten a little bit of a one-sided story relative to women. But I've had several men who've come and talked to us who were victims of abuse by their spouse,
Mm-hmm.
of physical abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt so sorry for this one man in New Hampshire. You know, he was nothing but a victim, and yet he's had his parental rights taken away.
Yep. Oh yeah. No, I've seen that on more than I'd care to tell.
How should anybody have the right to take away somebody's parental rights? I mean, should a judge even have that right? At least, I would say, at least let a jury of people decide.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. I think the whole concept of our legal judicial system was that it would be you would have the opportunity to appeal to a number of different people and to be able to present your case and allow that panel of your peers to be able to make a determination. You know, the scripture says that with many counsel, there's wise counsel. So the whole process should be that you get a lot of people being able to listen to it and then make a determination. I mean, they do that in third world countries. They have all the elders sit around and they say, oh, well, this looks like we ought to go this way, or it looks like we ought to go that way. But to have one individual judge make that determination leaves too much opportunity for abuse, and I believe is not even close to what our founders really envisioned.
Well, we all may not be willing to admit it, but we all have biases.
Yep.
We may not be biased against people of different races, but it doesn't matter. It may be what college you went to and what football team you support.
Right.
You know, I'll admit to probably having a bias there. But we all do. And so it's just so easy for that to happen when you just have one person involved. And it's very easy for that person to be influenced by money or
Yep.
a relationship with a law firm. But as I say to people, I was interviewed on a radio show the other night, and somebody was talking about, well, do you think it's this or that that's causing this to happen, and why they do this? I said, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that they're doing it. In my case, I don't know whether the judge was bribed or whether it was just the relationship with the other side, or this woman just looked at me and decided she liked the other people. It doesn't matter.
Right.
The fact that she did it and did things that were completely and totally against the law, and committed perjury and obstruction of justice out the wazoo. This is a 32-year federal judge. It wasn't like she made a mistake. I don't care why she did it. The fact that she did it is the problem.
Yep.
Well, now, are you going to run for office again?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yep, we're kind of weighing that.
Legislature for how long?
Retired in 2011, January 2011.
We could use you in Washington, D.C. in Congress.
We'll see how the Lord orchestrates. You know, it's public service. It's one of those that you do if there's a calling and a need, and we have, you know, we ran for Secretary of State in 2010 because we've got a corrupted voting system in Minnesota, the worst, and we've got a guy in there now who is the worst of the worst, Mark Ritchie. He is partisan, and he does not serve the best interests of the people of Minnesota. He serves the best interests of the far left progressive agenda, and he's just not doing the will of the people. We narrowly lost that race, ran for a Senate endorsement for the U.S. Senate seat. Weren't able to get that, but part of me just says, you know what, I've made my sacrifice. It's time to go out and make some money in the private sector and be a privateer for a little while. But ultimately, that's in the Lord's hands. I know that, you know, He's got plans, and those are the plans that I want.
Well, speaking totally from a selfish standpoint, we'd love to have someone like you in the House of Representatives, because it only takes one member of the House to start investigating corruption with a federal judge and to start impeachment proceedings. I'm currently a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives for the 6th Congressional District in Georgia. However, I will not have ever done a day's worth of campaigning. I haven't collected a penny in funds, and I'll get a few votes from people who know me. But next time the election comes out, I won't travel around the country, and I'll go knock on every one of those doors and try to convince people that we need to
Awesome.
Need to make a change.
Well, that's what it takes. That's what America's about. It's about people who are committed to the ideals that our founders really gave up everything for, and it's worth fighting for.
Well, it is. I tell people it's far worse today than it was when we signed the Declaration of Independence. I mean, that was child's play compared to what we have that we're facing today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I grew up went to grade school in the 50s, and we used to do these drills where you get under your desk and the Russians bombed us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, who would have ever thunk that our bigger enemy would be our own government?
Yes. Yeah.
When you went into the legislature in Minnesota, did they call all of you together the first day and say, look, the constituents no longer matter? Did that happen?
You know, it was pretty interesting because we were in a heated debate, and the Speaker of the House, then Steve Swigum, was talking to our caucus. And I was sitting next to a guy named Jeff Anderson, who was from southern Minnesota, a social studies teacher down there. And so he turns to Jeff and he says, Jeff, what are the priorities for voting in the caucus? And Jeff, without skipping a beat, said, conscience, constituency, caucus. You vote your conscience first, then you vote your constituency, and last you vote your caucus. Kind of took the Speaker off guard.
He was expecting a reversal.
Yeah, a little bit. But he was absolutely right.
Yeah, that's how it should be.
Yeah.
Well, what else would you like to talk
There was one other thing. Oh, you know, along the voting rights issue, you know, we've been working on this process that there's been just a plethora of voter fraud going on in Minnesota for a long period of time. But something that came up in the 2010 election was a Crow Wing County abuse that took place up there, where they had a group home that shipped in adult foster care people in, and they went to the polls and they didn't really vote. The people that brought them to the polls voted for them. And there was a whole bunch that was wrong with that process. Number one was that they were brought in by the provider for that care. The people that brought them in, there's documentation that they took the ballots, filled them out, then gave it back to the individual to give to the election day judge. Well, the election judge also was the county auditor for Crow Wing County. And so it says in statute you cannot be an election judge and be on the ballot. So that was in direct violation. There was nothing that ever happened for her. She ended up losing the election, but nothing punitive ever happened. The county attorney received the grievances and then buried them. A year later, after we put enough pressure on the county attorney, he finally convened a grand jury, and it was sequestered. So there was no results. They ended up saying that there was no fraud that took place, but we couldn't get into the files to see what the questions were that were asked. The county attorneys are part of the weak link in this whole election process. And there needs to be punitive charges. Now, there is a provision in the statute that says if a county attorney refuses to prosecute, they're guilty of a misdemeanor and are taken out of their job. That's what compelled this county attorney to hold the grand jury. But then it was sequestered, and so we couldn't get the results out. Part of this process now is, in the Constitution, one of the provisions says that in order for you to be able to vote, that you have to be of sound mind, that you cannot be under guardianship. And so the courts have reinterpreted the guardianship to say that we determine who's under guardianship. And the initial intent of the founders at that point was to say anybody who's under guardianship owes those people who are watching over their affairs, owes them something. So they have undue influence in that particular life, and they can influence how they vote. So the whole issue of guardianship shouldn't be that big question. It just should be, if you owe something to another man in that venue, then you shouldn't be able to vote because it can be skewed. So the courts again have gone beyond the confines of the Constitution. I was in the legislature in 2003 when that legislation went past. I had no idea it was in there. And so all of that to say is we have a broken election system. People need to understand that photo ID is really the answer to beginning to put the first steps of bringing accountability into this election system. And the Democrats and the liberal will do all they can to try and kill this initiative. But one person, one vote was our constitutional right given to us as U.S. citizens, and the only way to guarantee that is through accountability in the election process, and that's through photo ID.
Well, it happens to be one of the topic areas we have. We have like 14 categories of corruption, and voter fraud, voting corruption is one of them.
Yep.
So we have several people we've yet to interview along the way who are talking about that, and I never stopped to think about the fact that having a computerized system would be ripe for fraud. But when you think about it, it's totally ripe for fraud.
Well, I was just up in Aiken a few days ago, and they had, no, it was last night. It was over Minneapolis, and they were talking about up in Black Duck area. They had gone through the election process, and they had found 43 residents at this particular address when they were starting to go through the rolls and trying to say, well, what's going on here? So they went to the address. There's nothing there. 43 Johnsons registered at that address in Black Duck. And then there was another one that was 24, and it turned out to be a trailer house. 24 individuals at this particular trailer house. So our entire voter roll is skewed. It's corrupted. It's bad news. But this particular Secretary of State has no interest in voter integrity. And so hopefully someone will rise up and take him out in this next election.
Well, I hope so. I've heard his name in vain several times over the last week. So.
No, he's not doing the people's business.
Yeah. We have one woman who's going to give testimony, and she worked at the polls, and I don't know if it's part of her regular duty or not. I think she just chose to do it. She did a count, and I'll be doggone if when the election results weren't announced and there were no absentee ballots included in this that was reported, there was about 1,500 people more votes than she counted. She said she didn't even get up to go to the bathroom while she was there. So
no kidding.
we'll see.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I was involved in something in college. I was thought I was proud to become part of what they called the group, and the group was a bunch of the leaders who sadly decided how everything was going to happen at the university. And I don't know if they ever stuffed the ballot boxes or whatever, but I wouldn't put it past them.
Yeah, the ends justify the
I
means.
shouldn't be surprised with what's happening today.
Yeah.
I wasn't comfortable being in that. I never got out of it. I wish I'd had the guts to just get out of it. But they were exposed a number of years later, not too many years after I was there. But
Wow.
former governor of Texas was in it when he was a student and all these things.
Really?
So.
Huh. Interesting.
I suspect that it probably happens everywhere.
Yep.
Just about everywhere.
Well, it's the nature of man. There are some that strive for power at any means, and that does not, again, serve the general welfare of a republic. Bill, I want to thank you for having me here and taking this opportunity to talk, and I certainly appreciate what you're doing, and I believe in it.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to meet somebody who has served the public, who has the right mindset and understands that this is real.
Yeah.
There aren't enough of you out there. But hopefully we can educate a few more people with this.
Yep.
We're going to go, we invite you January 9th to meet us in D.C.
Uh-huh.
We're going to have one person for every constituent in the newly elected House. And we're personally delivering the 35 plus hours of congressional testimony that I'm doing them a favor by going around the country and taking.
Awesome.
And so we hope it'll have a little more impact when somebody who's a constituent walks in. We're going to film the whole thing. And then if the Washington Post doesn't cover it, we're loading up our 1355 passenger buses, and we're going to go over there and land in their lobby and ask to see a senior editor and ask them why they haven't covered it. Because the media, as you I'm sure know, is afraid of the judges, and they're aiding and abetting them.
Yep.
This is day 62 of my trip. Where's CBS? I invited CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, all of them. I said, put somebody in an RV and let them travel along with us. We'll give them an exclusive on all these stories.
Yeah.
And there's no response.
Well, and it was the same thing when I brought the media to the attention on this voter fraud that took place up in Crow Wing County. We had some immediate coverage over it, but there was an ongoing story, and I tried to get the media engaged in this, and they refused. I mean, it was like, this is the classic governmental abuse case that should be covered from head to tail on this thing, and it's not. It's because it's just not saucy enough, I guess. But when it gets down to it, it's about our republic.
Well, if there's a school bus crash in Duluth,
yeah,
and some children get injured, then on the news here it'll be, school bus crashes today, 15 children seriously injured. You sitting there and you watch and you find out it's in Duluth. Well, I mean, we all care about what happens in Duluth, but you think it's in your backyard, you think it's your neighbor's.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they'll cover something like that and sensationalize it, but they won't cover the fact that we no longer really have the most fundamental rights we're supposed to have.
Well, and I think there's a growing movement, though, of people who, take a look at the Tea Party, and people who want to be knowledgeable about what's going on in their government, so they're forearmed in this process. And I think that's what this is. This is part of that process. So thanks for what you're doing.
When I set up my website 6 years or so ago, I only found a couple of others. Today, my database has 5,000 websites from people trying to expose judicial corruption primarily.
Yep.
So, and it's different. Used to, when I would tell people a little bit about my story, their eyes would glaze over.
Yeah.
Now at the front desk out here, they're wanting my signature on the back of my business card because they figured it'd be worth something when I win the Academy Award. Or when I get on an elevator. I've had this happen twice in the last couple of weeks. We have a bunch of equipment. We normally have a lot more stuff than what we have here set up, but we actually already did our filming in Minneapolis, so we're doing a little simpler setup. I said, I'm sorry, we're filming a movie. I'm sorry, we got so much stuff in here. And this one lady said, what's the movie about? I said, judicial and government corruption. And she kind of nodded, and I said, are you a victim? And she said, aren't we all? And that's a change. That's a change from where it was 5 or 6 years ago. People really are waking up. So hopefully we can reach millions. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Bill.